The Honorable Jim DeMint, former senator from South Carolina, chairman of the Conservative Partnership Institute, and a longtime friend to many of us on this committee. Senator DeMint served the American people in both houses of Congress. From 1999 to 2005, he represented South Carolina's 4th District, and from 2007 to 2013, he represented the state of South Carolina in the United States Senate, where he authored leading conservative reforms to health care, to education, taxes, and entitlements. Among his many achievements, Senator DeMint led conservative efforts to ban congressional earmarks, something that the Republican conference this year made a permanent ban within our conference. Most relevant to today's hearing, Senator DeMint led an effort to impose term limits on members of the House and Senate, ultimately taking a resolution that would have expressed the sense of the Senate that the Constitution ought to be amended to include term limits to the floor of the Senate. At the conclusion of his service in the Senate, Senator DeMint became the president of the Heritage Foundation, working there for 4 years. Senator DeMint is currently the chairman of the Conservative Policy Institute, and he is also the founder of the Senate Conservatives Fund. Senator DeMint is the author of several books, including Now or Never, Saving America from Economic Collapse, The Great American Awakening, 2 Years That Changed America, Saving Freedom, We Can Stop America's Slide into Socialism, and most recently, Falling in Love with America Again, which debuted at number 1 on the Washington Post bestseller list. Senator DeMint, welcome, and I would ask that you stand and be sworn in. You'd raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, former colleagues on the subcommittee. It's extremely gracious of you to invite me today, especially considering I'm going to spend my time advocating for your unemployment. It's nothing personal, I promise. I get the opportunity to travel all over the country and speak to a lot of groups, and I find there are many issues where the opinions of the American people and Congress are divergent. But there are few issues where that gap is as large as the issue of term limits. If you need a standing applause line, it's talk about term limits, and people will stand up and applaud. As Mr. Chairman, you've already pointed out, somewhere between 75–80% of Americans believe in term limits, not only for congressmen and senators, but they sure like the idea of judges and bureaucrats because they instinctively know what is an eternal truth, that power corrupts. And in Washington, seniority is closely associated with power. There are good arguments for and against congressional term limits, and these are roughly the same arguments that delegates debated at the Constitutional Convention. It was George Mason of Virginia who argued that nothing is so essential to the preservation of a Republican government as a periodic rotation of its representatives. For his part, Rufus King of New York insisted that he who has proved himself to be most fit for an office ought not to be excluded by the Constitution from holding it. In theory, both are right. A governmental turnover is undeniably healthy for any republic, especially for one as large and diverse as we are. Meanwhile, disqualifying unusually capable legislators from serving would be a definite loss to our country. The philosophical argument about term limits can be a close call, as it was in 1787. Unlike our founders, however, we don't have to confine our debate to theoretical abstractions. We can draw on real-world experience with our 230-year-old system, and especially its performance over the last few decades. And the practical case for term limits, Mr. Chairman, is no longer a close call. We do not have to speculate, as the founders did, that the prospect of a permanent tenure in Congress might tempt senators and representatives towards self-interested, short-term thinking. We know for a fact, especially in recent decades when control of Congress has been constantly up for grabs, this short-term thinking has become Congress's defining defect. For individual members, short-term thinking warps incentives towards bringing home the bacon and fundraising, and to the special interest who can deliver them both. Members spend less time legislating and more time raising money, both for their own re-elections and for the political action committees specifically designed to finance their careerist ambitions. And members quickly give up their campaign promises of bold ideas such as balancing the budget and turn to new programs spending more money that they can deliver to their constituents. As individual members have retreated from their legislative responsibilities, party leaders have, however poorly, filled the gap. Given their incentives, leaders now use the House and Senate not as legislative institutions, but as arms of their party's campaign committees. The Senate, in particular, no longer functions as a legislative body at all. Leaders of both parties have shut down deliberative floor debate and amendment votes for the sole purpose of shielding senators from politically controversial votes, thereby denying the American people's right to an accountable legislature. Members who criticize this dysfunctional shirts versus skins approach are chastised for not being team players and threatened with being cut off from their party leader's special interest fundraising gravy train. Conscious, burdened senators and representatives are reassured that this process, however imperfect, is simply how they make their way in Washington. But in truth, it's how Washington makes its way into them. Lifelong tenure incentivizes members to prioritize the next election over the next generation and partisanship over statesmanship. It realigns their interest away from the American people and towards the swamp. The consequences are all around us. The $22 trillion national debt, the wasteful pork barrel programs appropriated specifically to facilitate members' reelection, the unreformed entitlement programs that both parties know are hurling the nation into insolvency, Congress's lack of oversight over the sprawling federal bureaucracy, the power of special interest, particularly the corrupt allure of a lucrative post-congressional career on K Street for members who play ball, the total disappearance of the budget process, the breakdown of the legislative process, especially in the Senate, the mindless partisanship, the collapse of public confidence in Congress as an institution. Now, I know term limits would not solve all of these problems, but they would significantly change incentives throughout the political system. In Washington, fundraising would become less important, and so special interests would be less powerful, and partisanship less personally or politically rewarding. Term limits might open up space and maybe even provide a little courage towards action on politically difficult issues like entitlement reform, health care, immigration, and budget reform. By closing off avenues to be something important, term limits might reintroduce senators and representatives to the appeal of doing something important for their constituents, for their country, and for themselves. The end result would be more accountable, more statesmanlike, and in time, a more trusted and respected Congress. Mr. Chairman, as I said before, our Congress is on an unsustainable course. We do have the $22 trillion debt, near $1 trillion annual deficits. The trust funds for Social Security and Medicare have been spent on other things. The transportation fund is empty, and we could go on and on. That's why when I ran for Congress, I limited my own term, consistent with your amendment of 6 years in the House and 2 in the Senate, hoping to get the freedom to rock the boat, to challenge the system, to try to change this unsustainable course where one that we can actually build a better America. And I'm grateful for you for introducing it. I am very well aware of all the arguments on both sides. But when I came to Congress, I supported term limits in theory. Now I support it after seeing what really happens here. And we know, as I said before, that power corrupts, and it has corrupted absolutely here in Washington, and it's the seniority system that drives it all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will entertain any questions if you'd like.
Thank you, Senator DeMint, for your powerful testimony. I will say something you said at the tail end there is actually something I found myself saying many times when I'm back in Texas, which is before I was elected to the Senate, I supported term limits. But having now served here, having seen it firsthand, I support term limits 1,000 times more. You've served in both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Can you share from your own experience what serving in Congress, why that led you to support term limits, why it underscored the need for a limit on the terms?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believed coming in as a businessman who've never been involved in politics of the idea of citizen statesmen, of folks coming to Washington and representing their constituents for a limited period and then coming back and living under the laws that they passed. I did find a lot, if you limit your own term under the current situation, you are at a disadvantage. I was denied committees, a number of things. I was told right away if I wanted to raise money in Washington, I need to disavow my pledge. It's certainly not a welcomed thing here in Washington. But as I said before, the most important thing to me was not to become a part of the problem that I ran for Congress to get rid of. And that was the entrenched political establishment that was vested in the status quo, careening our country towards really bankruptcy and a lot of other things that bothered me. I felt term limits would give me the freedom to come, rock the boat, fight the system, and not feel like I had to have my eyes on the prize of a committee or a chairmanship or eventually to be in leadership. And I knew limiting my term and especially rocking the boat that none of those were going to come my way. And I think it is true. My perspective was always different. I always said if you're going to run a race and you know it's 100 yards, you can give it your all. And I did that in the House and the Senate. But if you're just going out jogging for a ways, you can do it for a long, long time. And you don't really reach a destination in the same way you did. So, again, I've heard the arguments, Mr. Chairman, that, oh, we'll have a permanent staff, we'll have a permanent bureaucracy, that elections are the best term limits, but we know the power of incumbency. We know what's happened to preserve the seniority system, and it's way beyond what it was when I got here. And the only way to limit terms were the way we did it for the President of the United States, and that's to put it in the Constitution.
In your testimony, you talked about incentives. It's been my observation that the dominant incentive in the United States Senate, and for that matter in the House, is risk aversion. I've been at numerous town halls back home in Texas where citizens will ask, they'll say, do members of Congress, do they believe anything? Are they just, did they believe anything when they first ran? And what I usually share with folks is I said, look, I think most people who run for Congress, they do so because they do believe in some principles. On the Democratic side, on the Republican side, they come here with an idea of changing things. But then the incentives become the overwhelming, dominant desire is I must get reelected. And that dwarfs anything else, and they find themselves, it's a little bit like the wonderful movie series The Godfather, where in each of those movies is the story of Michael Corleone, the good son, making decisions, each of which seems in its own perfectly reasonable, perfectly rational. Michael steps forward to save his father. His father's going to be murdered. But each of those small rationalization leads him down the road to becoming a mass murderer. In much the same way, I think elected members of Congress, they make small concessions to, well, I want to do something big. I want to balance the budget. I want to address the debt. I want to strengthen and reform Social Security and Medicare, but I got to get reelected first. And it's those series of small concessions, one after the other, that they find, and I think this is true on both sides of the aisle. You look at both Republicans and Democrats who are afraid to work together in a bipartisan manner because the overwhelming objective is we must get reelected. Do those observations, does that comport with what you saw when you served here and what you see as an informed observer today?
Yes, they do, but I don't think either one of us want to suggest that our unterm limited colleagues are mass murderers, Mr. Chairman. And so I wouldn't want to associate with that, and I know that's not what you meant. What I have observed is that everyone, Republican and Democrat, comes here with good intentions and a lot of bold ideas to change, but it usually comes to change the system. We find very quickly that there is no reward for changing something. There's particularly no reward for cutting anything, eliminating any program, or cutting spending. All the rewards here in Washington are for growing government, spending more money, and creating more programs and protecting the status quo. I have seen, again, that people come with a lot of good intentions, but there are very few, I could probably count them on one hand, out of the more than 500 congressmen and senators who have been here more than 10 years, who are still really fighting for those things they came for. And I think that should just tell us something on its face, that this place, this town, this swamp, changes the whole alignment from what we come for and what we end up doing. It's just bigger than we are as individuals. Term limits would allow folks to keep their focus back home on what they're going to do after Congress. It would make sure that they did everything they can before the next election to accomplish their goals, rather than what we see here time and time again. Just like I read in the news today, there will be no consideration of health reform until after the next election. And I heard that so many times, Mr. Chairman, DeMint, this is not the right time or the right way to do this. You need to wait. And again, I'm not suggesting this is going to solve all our problems. The ranking member has mentioned other things that we can do. So this is not a silver bullet, but this is one that will fundamentally change incentives and align what we do here with, I think, our founders' vision of citizen statesmen representing the American people.
Although I might be obliged to say that Mo Green was a friend of mine, I will take your friendly amendment that at least the overwhelming majority of members of Congress are not currently mass murderers.
Okay.
With that, Senator Harron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I note that the chairman noted that members of Congress are very risk averse and that the only thing they care about is re-elections, and therefore they are risk averse. But I have to note that, for example, when the Affordable Care Act was passed, that was a huge change to our health care laws. There were people in Congress who lost their elections, re-elections, because they voted for the ACA. I would hardly call that risk averse. Or when the Senate passed the Comprehensive Immigration Law Act, which sadly the Republican-controlled House did not act upon, that was a huge risk-taking move on the part of the Senate. Or I have to say, when we voted on Judge Kavanaugh to become a lifetime justice on the Supreme Court, you had 3 members of the Senate who voted against him, knowing full well that their re-election was going to be hurt, and in fact, they lost their election. So I hardly think that, that kind of broad statement does us much good, in my opinion. Now, Senator, were you aware that since 2013, the average time of senators has been 10.2 years, and that the average term of House members is 9.1 years, and then among the 116th Congress, that the average term of senators is only 10.6 years? Did you know that?
Yes, I did.
So even without term limits, people are not staying the kind of, forever as you postulate. So I just put that in also for the record.
May I comment?
Well, are you disputing the amount of time that senators and House members stay?
I found that lots of new members come and go, and folks serve for a shorter time. Just after the great 2010 Tea Party, lots of new people came in, or the 1994 the Republican Revolution in the House. But what happens is all these new people with bold ideas come in, and all of the committees are controlled by senior members who've been here 15 and 20 years. That's what I found. All the the changing Social Security, the things to fix Medicare, the things I came to do, balancing the budget, they were always thwarted by senior members in both parties on committees that were standing for the status quo.
Excuse me, Senator, but I would say that the Tea Party had tremendous sway in the U.S. House because I was there. Let me move on. I think you said in your opening statement that voters favor term limits for judges. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes, they do.
So do you think that is a good idea, that we should have term limits for federal judges?
I think it's something
Supreme Court?
we should debate and consider. It's not part of of Senator Cruz's amendment, but I know from talking to people around the country, the lifetime appointment for judges is not a very popular idea.
Yeah, I would think so, especially now as we're packing the courts with a lot of judges who have very strong ideological perspectives. You mentioned in other statements that corruption is related to seniority of elected officials. Is that just a feeling from your experience, or is there data that reflects that connection between corruption and seniority?
I think there's a lot of evidence. We certainly have seen senior members of committee, particularly back in the earmark days, where many members were...
Of course, we no longer have earmarks.
That is something that would not have happened if I had not been term limited. I can guarantee you that, because I led the effort in the Senate, and it was very unpopular among senior members and of both parties and of K Street.
Well, actually, I'm asking you if you can cite to any studies or any analysis that points to a connection between corruption and seniority, because I'd like to read those studies.
Well, there are a number of people who've been to jail for corruption, and a lot of those are senior committees, particularly appropriators over the years, and that data is readily available.
I would have to look it up in Google or something. Okay. I mean, I'd really like us to, just as I think all of us share the concern over corruption, of course, and there's a lot of that's happening right now in front of our faces. But be that as it may, I'm not so sure that term limits is the answer. I'm glad that you mentioned that it's not the silver bullet. It's not the be-all and end-all. So, speaking of studies, are you familiar with the academic literature, like the work of one of our upcoming witnesses, Professor Linda Powell, which shows us empirically that term limits don't have the effect of cleaning up government or of making it more effective or responsive?
I'm very familiar with it, and have been a part of those studies looking at term limits at the state level. It's clearly evident that states like California have been able to game the system, while we see states like Florida where they have actually, because of term limits, a lot of positive reforms and education choice, pension reform, keeping their tax rate low, keeping their economy. Of course, I've seen the studies. But states are much smaller. The corruption possibility, the concentration of power is nothing like what it is up here. So I see the arguments for, again, I work on term limits at the state level and I believe in it, but I think the real change would happen if we limited terms in Washington.
We are going to hear from Professor Powell later. So I take it you don't agree with those conclusions in those studies. So did you say that you can cite to evidence that points the other way, that term limits, in fact, would reduce
a lot of my evidence is
the
experience.
That
I was here, and I've seen the studies. Again, I've been part of a lot of them. But my conclusion after serving is that term limits would drastically change the incentives and do a lot to reduce corruption and do a whole lot more to get people representing the good of the country, which, again, I think the subject of term limits can come under the title of what do we have to lose. If we look at where this country is right now, I cannot imagine any collection of alternative representatives who could have done our country more of a misservice than the people who've been here the last 3 decades, and I include myself in that number.
Mr. Chairman, I realize I'm about the time that you spent. May I ask just one more question? In my opening statement, I cited to certain things that we could do to make voting much easier, to make sure that our voting systems are not hacked. Do you agree with those items that I cited?
I think we should do everything we can to facilitate the voting of American citizens.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. You know, I would note that in response to the observation about congressional risk aversion, that Senator Hirono pointed to 3 examples she cited of congressional courage. The vote of the Democratic majorities in favor of Obamacare, the vote of the Democratic majorities in favor of amnesty, and the Democrats who voted against the confirmation of Justice Brett Kavanaugh. While those may be examples of courage, those are also examples where those elected officials were voting, number one, consistently with big money special interest here in Washington. But number two, in each of those circumstances, they were voting against the overwhelming interest and views of their constituents, which is why the Obamacare vote produced the Republican takeover of the House of Representatives in 2010. It is why the amnesty vote helped produce the Republican takeover of the Senate in 2014, and it is why the vote against Justice Kavanaugh retired several Democratic members, because in those instances the senators were voting against the views and interests of their constituents. In this instance, with term limits, the overwhelming majority of my constituents, of Senator Hirono's constituents, and everyone else's agree with term limits, and we ought to have the courage to stand and fight for our constituents.
Obviously, we have a disagreement.
Yes.
There you go. What a democracy. Thank you.
Senator Sass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for scheduling this very important hearing. Senator DeMint, thank you for being here. Thanks for your work on this topic. Thanks also and congratulations for your work on the earmark ban. As has been reported, the Republican conference voted last month to permanently ban earmarks.
I can't believe that.
Yeah. In 2010, in 2012, 14, and 16, there was an earmark ban, and every year it came back, sort of Frankenstein-like, that the default assumption was at the end of this Congress there should be earmarks again. And so instead of banning them for another 2 years, I led the charge in our conference with an important assist from Senator Cruz, trying to get that earmark ban to be made permanent. But we want to make sure you get lots of credit for the fact that you were one of the first people championing this. So thank you and congratulations.
Well, thank you for following through.
I think Mr. Smith Goes to Washington would have been an incredibly crappy movie if Jimmy Stewart had stayed around for 100 years, cozied up to K Street, and done absolutely everything conceivably possible to keep his job here. And yet, there's no way you can tell the really important story about someone coming to fight for something if one of their main calculi, I'm not sure of the Latin, one of the main inputs to the way they think about the question is this going to be popular 12 months or 18 or 24 months from now, as opposed to, is this the right thing to do for my kids and my constituents' kids and grandkids? We need a lot more long-term thinking around here, not short-term finger-in-the-windism. And if we're going to do that, if you're going to drain the swamp, you have to drive a whole bunch of people who are the swamp protectors out of the swamp to go back home. And what we have right now is a whole bunch of people who get elected and decide it's a one-way ticket. People are from where they're from, they run for office, and then once they get to Washington, they buy a permanent home and they eventually stop visiting the home they came from, and they start to have a calculus that staying in Washington forever is a key part of defining their identity and their service. And I think it's pretty obvious that one of the reasons we never tackle entitlement reform around here is because it's obviously the right long-term thing to do, and in the short term, it's going to be really messy to admit the truth that politicians haven't told the truth about the long-term budget, and we've regularly overpromised. And when you come clean with the American people about that, there's going to be a whole bunch of blood on the floor at first when you tell the truth about that. So I would love it if you would itemize a few of the most important topics of legislation that you think we all know we should tackle, and yet short-term political calculus leads everybody to say, well, maybe after the next election.
Thank you, Senator. I recall after the 2010 elections, a number of us wanted to balance the budget. And we picked the debt limit as a fight, that we would grant the debt limit increase if we could get legislation to balance the budget over 10 years. We called it cut, cap, and balance. In reality, there was very little cut in spending. It was a slowing of growth over a 10-year period and some economic incentives where the growth actually balanced the budget in 10 years. I was just amazed by my own party that this was such a simple idea after a wave of people had been elected in Tea Party on the Constitution, on balancing the budget, about what about the debt and the bailouts, that the most resistance we had from balancing the budget over a 10-year period was from all the senior members, particularly the appropriators in the Senate, including and especially the Republican leadership. It was just such a good example of a wave of new people who came in with fresh from the campaign trail, where they made all these promises and commitments to people, and they came with vision and just love for the country. But everyone told them immediately that their expectations were too high. And that's what this place does to you. It dumbs down your expectation within weeks of getting here. And the nexus of power and reward is all from seniority. The fundraising gets more, the special interests get behind you, and then you have more control of the communications. And if you are trying to cut spending, like if I had to give you one thing, it would be we've got to balance the budget. We cannot keep spending more than we're bringing in. But cutting anything in Washington has so much punishment associated with it by every constituent of every program that no reasonable person is going to keep doing that. You're either going to go home or you're going to get unelected. And so we've got all the incentives in place here to destroy our country. I think one of the only ways to change those incentives is to bring new people up here who know they're going to be here for a short period and they're going to give it everything they've got for their country, and one way or another they're going to go home. But if they're fighting for a lifetime career, they're going to do what all of you have suggested right away. The calculus of what do I have to do to stay here? And it's to do something up here and pretend to be something else back home. That's the game.
Could you unpack, we're almost at time, but could you unpack just a little bit more the distinction you drew between California and Florida? Because there are lots of thoughtful people who oppose term limit legislation. And one of the things they regularly say is that many state capitals have the example of term limits that were passed that actually empowered staff and lobbyists and didn't lead to significant legislative courage and reform. And you drew a distinction between California where they don't, or haven't worked, and Florida where they have. Can you unpack why?
Well, it would be a longer discussion, but California does game the system. It is very controlled by one party of people who move in and out, but they'll move from one thing to another to an appointed position. And there's someone, I'm sure a lot of people who could explain it better than I, but I have been with legislatures all over the country. And the vibrancy of those legislators who are under term limits, particularly all you have to do is go to an event in Florida. And again, it's not perfect. It doesn't solve all the problems. But they're thinking about what's best for the state now. What can I do now? And they're also thinking how they can bump off some of you guys up here and graduate because they're term limited at the state level. And whether that's healthy or not, I'm not sure. But I do know up here we've got term limit on the Republican side of some committee chairman. We game that system. As soon as they term limit L1, they'll go to be chairman of another committee based on seniority. But the problems at here are very different than the state in that we have, particularly as senators, very large staff. But I've seen as new members come in, they bring in a lot of their own people. The problems are the committees. We need to rotate those staff off periodically. But we can do that. That's not a problem that should keep us from doing something that we know would create a more responsive legislature, a more responsive Congress here. So again, I've heard all the excuses. I've seen the analysis of the different states. Some do it well, some don't. But the bottom line for me, after serving here and looking at all the evidence, and direct research as well as anecdotal, is this is one of the most important reforms that we could make.
Thank you. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator DeMint, for being here. I've known you for a long time and admired you from afar, long before I came to know you as a friend and colleague. And I especially appreciate your message today. It reminds me a little bit of a statement that was attributed to St. Augustine during his conversion to Christianity, when he said something to the effect of, Lord, grant me chastity and virtue, but not yet. He wanted to wait. It's always easier to wait to do the right thing. It's especially true in Washington. You mentioned a minute ago some of the arguments that are frequently raised in response to the argument for term limits. One of them is that it's not a panacea. It won't solve every problem, as if to suggest that if we can't solve every problem with term limits, we shouldn't try to solve this one. What can you tell us, based on your experience, about how individual members might behave differently if term limits were on the books and they were imposed by the constitutional amendment?
Well, we've talked a lot about it, but if, again, the freedom that comes from being able to act for your constituents and not to act towards getting a future position on a committee or a chairmanship, and most of you know, sitting up there, you rocked the boat your first year up here, which you did. The chances of you going into elected leadership in the conference go down dramatically. It would surprise me. And so, again, if you come up and you want to get to be the prize when I got here was to be a senior member of appropriations. Once the earmarks went away, it was not nearly as desirable of a committee to be on. But to have the seniority means you raise more money. All the lobbyists come to your fundraisers. That creates a ability of you to endear yourself to other members by raising money in your PAC. All of this just creates, again, a nexus of power that goes with seniority and that we see with corruption. And if I could just interject, one of my colleagues here just handed me a list of 13 former senior members who have been sent to jail because of bribery or corruption here in this is the American government. This is 13 here. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit these names for the record if I could.
Without objection.
But the evidence is everywhere that seniority, again, protects the status quo. It stops us from solving the huge problems. And then it's the seniority system that allows people to come in and create this new program, because the only bipartisan consensus now in Congress is when you create something new and spend more money. There is never any other bipartisan agreement.
That's well said. I appreciate your insight on that. I also especially appreciated the distinction you drew during your opening testimony between the philosophical arguments for term limits and the practical arguments. It's just interesting to think about the fact that this 230-year-old document is one that has functioned well. It's fostered the development of the greatest civilization the world has ever known, and it has done so in part because of the fact that it adequately harnessed human nature. It took into account certain aspects of human nature and pitted one faction against another, one branch of government against another, so that no one person or group of people could get too much power. I think they probably did, as you were alerting to earlier, make the right decision when they had decided initially not to put term limits into the original Constitution. There are some things that have changed since then, or that the Founding Fathers didn't adequately take into account. I suspect that one of them might have been the rise of the dominant two-party system. Another might have been the excessive accumulation of power within Washington, the transfer of as much power from the states to Washington as has happened. And then with that transfer of power, the drive to delegate out the lawmaking power to someone else. Can you speak to that and what the Founding Fathers might have missed?
A lot has changed. I think if we really knew the conditions of those serving in the early Congresses, it would not be necessary to limit terms, in the sense of it was not full-time. There was very little pay. There were no retirement programs or thrift savings programs, limited staff, long travel to get here. It was certainly a sacrifice. So folks needed to have other jobs back home, farms or whatever, to make things work. There wasn't quite the danger. But now the allure here in Washington is quite different, that you can make it a full-time career with decent retirement and a post-congressional career that can be very lucrative. Lots of staff. Again, it's a very different situation. And the money in politics, and I think as you alluded to, Senator Lee, is the power that has convened here in Washington, D.C. from all over the world. It's here because of the concentration of political power. Now we have the concentration of economic power, concentration of media power, and all of that really comes back to the real powers and the seniority within these walls. And we can't fix it with one fell swoop, but we can sure break up a lot of it and change the incentives in a hurry.
Well said. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator DeMint. One final question. You testified about how public opinion supports term limits 80-20, and this is across racial lines, across ethnic lines, across party lines, Republicans, Democrats, Independents. When you brought forward your resolution in support of term limits before the Senate, it was voted down 75-24. Do you know of another issue on which the views of Congress are so wildly out of step? The American people supported 80-20, and yet the Senate votes it down 75-24 on the opposite side. Do you know of another issue in which the views are so wildly out of step, and why is it that career politicians in both parties are defying the will of their constituents?
It's a great question, and again, it's still a great issue to run on. But a lot of the money now, even when you're running for office, is not going to be there if you limit your term. I was told that when I ran for Senate, that a lot of the big PACs are not going to give to you if you limit your term because they don't want to invest in someone who's not going to be there very long. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your initiative on this issue, and I hope it will get some open and honest debate.
Very good. Thank you, Senator DeMint. We'll call up the second panel and proceed immediately to the second panel.
Well, while we're waiting for the second panel, you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, how many other issues do the American people support by a wide margin? Yes, they support gun legislation, they support abortion. We're not doing anything about those either in the Senate. Try to get rid of it.
Well,
anyway, rather than getting into a big
well, no. Senator Hirono, if you're going to make a statement, I'll at least respond with the facts. The overwhelming majority of Americans support the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. And when it comes to abortion, the current position of the modern Democratic Party, which supports unlimited abortion on demand, partial birth abortion up until the moment of birth, with taxpayer funding and no parental notification and consent, 9% of Americans agree with the position of today's Democratic Party. That is an extreme and out-of-step position.
I disagree. There are facts to support why I disagree. Okay, second panel.
Pleased to introduce four witnesses on our second panel. Mr. Nick Tomboulides is the Executive Director of U.S. Term Limits, one of the nation's leading